The cold wind whipped through the city streets, tugging at Jackson's coat as he made his way to the small cafe on the corner. His hands shook slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of the decision he had made. Today was the day he would finally confront the guilt that had haunted him for years. It had been too long, and the truth had been buried for far too long. He pushed open the door to the cafe, the warmth inside doing little to thaw the knot of anxiety in his chest. Sitting at a corner table was Clara, a woman he had thought about every day for the past 5 years, but hadn't had the courage to face until now. She looked up when the door chimed, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. She didn't know the full story. She didn't know why he had reached out to her after all this time, or why he had been so desperate to meet. But today, Jackson was going to tell her everything. He walked over to the table, forcing a small smile as he sat down. "Clara," he said quietly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." She nodded, her hands clasped around the coffee mug in front of her. "Of course. I wasn't sure why you wanted to talk, but I'm here." Jackson swallowed hard, his mind flashing back to that day, the day everything had changed. It had been a typical morning, busy streets, the usual hustle and bustle of city life. He had been walking to work, lost in his thoughts, when he heard the screech of tires and the unmistakable sound of a collision. A car had hit a pedestrian in the crosswalk. Everything had happened so fast. Jackson had rushed forward without thinking, his instincts kicking in. He had been one of the first to reach the scene, pulling the injured man, a young guy in his 20s, away from the wreckage. The man's leg was badly mangled, blood pouring from the wound, but he was conscious, gasping for air and clutching Jackson's hand as he begged for help. Jackson had stayed with him until the paramedics arrived, talking to him, reassuring him, keeping him calm. The paramedics had told him later that his quick actions had saved the man's life. He should have felt relief. He should have felt pride. But all he felt was guilt. Because while Jackson had been focused on saving that young man, he had heard another voice, a woman's voice, calling for help from further down the street. He hadn't seen her at first, hadn't even realized she was there until he heard her cry out. But by then, it had been too late. She had been hit by debris from the crash, pinned beneath a fallen sign. By the time anyone reached her, she was already gone. Clara's mother. Jackson had never been able to shake the image of her lying there, alone and dying while he had been focused on someone else. He had saved one life, but he had let another slip away. And the guilt of that decision, the guilt of not having done more, of not having been able to save her, had consumed him ever since. "I need to tell you why I reached out," Jackson said, his voice heavy with emotion. "It's about your mother." Clara's face tightened, the familiar pain flickering in her eyes at the mention of her mother. "What about her?" Jackson's throat tightened, the confession feeling like a weight on his chest. "I was there that day," he said quietly. "I was there when the accident happened. I was one of the first people on the scene." Clara's eyes widened slightly, but she stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. I helped someone else that day. A young man who was hit by the car. I stayed with him, made sure he was okay. But I didn't see your mother until it was too late." His voice cracked, the guilt spilling out in waves. "I heard her calling for help, but I didn't go to her. I didn't get there in time, and I should have. I should have been there for her." Clara's expression remained unreadable, her fingers tightening around the mug as she processed his words. You were there?" Jackson nodded, feeling the weight of the confession pressing down on him. "I've been carrying this guilt for years. I saved that man's life, but I didn't save your mother. And I've thought about it every day since. I should have done more." Clara was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the table. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest, the fear of her reaction almost unbearable. Would she hate him for what he had done, for what he hadn't done? Would she blame him for not saving her mother, for focusing on someone else when her mother had needed help just as much? Finally, Clara looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "You couldn't have saved everyone," she said softly. "It wasn't your fault. You did what you could." Jackson shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. "But it feels like I failed her. I failed you. I should have been there for her. Clara's expression softened, and she reached across the table, placing her hand on his. You saved someone's life that day. That's not failure, Jackson. You didn't choose who to help. You did what you could in a chaotic situation. Jackson swallowed hard, the tears finally spilling over. I've been trying to find a way to make it right. I don't know how to fix it, but I want to help you. I want to do whatever I can to make up for the fact that I wasn't there for her. Clara squeezed his hand gently. You can't bring her back. But you don't have to carry this guilt alone. My mother, she was a kind woman. She would have understood. She wouldn't want you to punish yourself for something that wasn't your fault. Jackson's chest tightened, the burden of guilt beginning to lift, if only slightly. I'm so sorry, Clara. I've spent years trying to figure out how to make up for what happened. Clara nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I appreciate that you came to me, that you told me the truth. It means a lot. And if you really want to help, maybe we can find a way to honor my mother together. Something that can make a difference like you did that day. Jackson blinked, surprised by her suggestion. You'd let me do that? Clara smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. You've been carrying this guilt for a long time. Maybe it's time to turn it into something good. Jackson nodded, feeling a sense of hope for the first time in years. He couldn't go back and change what had happened. He couldn't bring back the life that had been lost. But perhaps, in helping Clara find peace, he could finally find some peace of his own. The road to redemption wasn't easy, and the weight of guilt wouldn't disappear overnight. But together, they could build something new, something that honored the lives they had touched, both the ones they had saved and the ones they had lost. And for the first time in years, Jackson felt like maybe, just maybe, he could finally forgive himself. The Lifesaver's guilt would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. Now, he had the chance to create something that mattered, something that would bring healing to both himself and Clara. And that, he realized, was the first step toward redemption.
If you like our videos, remember to leave a like and subscription. It always helps us in growing this channel and community. Remember, leave a comment with your opinion on this episode.